Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you happen to be watching today's broadcast of this webinar brought to you today by ESI Group. My name is Eric Kahn. I am the Product Marketing Manager for ESI Group, and I'm here today to speak with you about the topic of how we can apply what we call human-centric process validation to help you keep your timing on rails by using IC.IDO to virtualize the validation of building vehicles, maintaining them, and making sure that your products are well suited for the human beings who have to interact with these products as we bring them to market. As I said, my name is Eric Kahn and I work for ESI Group, and I want to kick off our webinar today with just a brief introduction, hopefully very brief, of what are we, who are we at ESI Group, and what do we do at ESI Group when it comes to applying virtual typing to the rail industry. After that, I'm going to talk to you a bit more about how we apply this idea of using virtual reality to validate those human interactions that frequently happen whenever we have people and products interacting in the assembly or the operation or the maintenance of your rail products, locomotives, or rolling stock. We'd like to talk a little bit more about what the value of human-centered process validation is, and then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples of how we are currently actively applying IC.IDO to help your industry as well as other industries revolutionize the way that they're developing their products today. So in brief, here at ESI Group, we are a software company. We build and deliver software that's specifically targeted to help our customers reach their business objectives. We try to provide technology that helps you accelerate your time to market while lowering your operational costs. We also want to help you validate that you have addressed and reduced the risk to your product, to your industry, to your quality, and improve that quality, thus preventing yourselves from costly recalls or issues. And all of this helps us bring a more sustainable and more repeatable business to our own industries and enterprises. So a quick introduction, continuing with that introduction to ESI Group. Here at ESI Group, I told you we make software specific for the topic of performing what we like to think of as virtual prototyping. Now, chances are you're thinking virtual prototyping, ESI Group, maybe you've not heard of us before, but chances are you've heard of us before if you've ever heard of PAM Crash. PAM Crash was one of the flagship products that brought ESI its notoriety, and we now package PAM Crash and that crash worthiness analysis inside of something we call the virtual performance solution. Maybe you've heard of Simulation X. That's another one of our product lines that we use for doing 0D, 1D, and model-based systems engineering validations. Maybe you've heard of PAM Composites or PAM Stamp. These are virtual manufacturing suites that help us validate the piece part manufacturing and piece part fabricating of various components that could go into your products. Maybe you've heard of Procast. That is our casting simulation software. Or maybe you've heard of SysWeld, a product we use to validate the welding and joining of various materials that were produced by various methods and joining them together. Or maybe some of you haven't heard of our manufacturing products, you hadn't heard about our crashworthiness, but maybe some of you have heard about our vibroacoustic solution, VA1. And hopefully you are all currently hearing about now, or maybe you've heard about our virtual reality tool, IC.IDO. Now, a lot of times I find myself having to explain to people, like, that sounds like a lot of different things that ESI Group is doing. And our focus at ESI Group is to help people validate all of these different decisions that have to be made as you're trying to bring a new product to market. So take, for example, the idea of this systems engineering that might happen with Simulation X. You can see that looks like a schematic drawing of a possible drivetrain, whether that was an electric drivetrain or a diesel drivetrain. Maybe this is a mechanical system. And what happens quite often is that we could use tools like Simulation X to model the product topology of a diesel electric locomotive, or maybe we're doing a battery electric locomotive that's counting on the overhead power lines or the charged rails underneath. And if we're thinking about an electric train and its integration of various components, maybe every once in a while we'll find out that a particular locomotive performance we're trying to achieve might require larger motors in the drivetrain and in the bogies of that locomotive. And I might use IC.IDO in virtual integration and this idea of validating assembly or validating service. And maybe I find out that this bigger motor that the model-based simulation told me was necessary, I needed to put a larger motor in there that would force me to re-engineer the packaging or the configuration of my train's bogies. If that happens, then maybe you might need to use a different one of the ESI software to validate the casting or the welding or the fabrication of that bogie. And in doing so, we might recognize that there are limitations that geometry that would force us to make different decisions about product integration that could trigger a new iteration of that model-based simulation that we used. So quite often, by having all of these different engineering disciplines that we address is in terms of this virtual prototyping at ESI Group, we feel that we give everybody a very holistic view of, do they have products that perform correctly? Do we have products that can be manufactured so that they meet the requirements of that performance? And very importantly, what I focus on with IC.IDO is that I want to make sure that if I'm engineering a new rail product, that the humans that have to help me assemble it, the human beings that operate and use that train, and also the people who maintain and provide service on that train will all be able to do so safely, repeatably, and ensuring that we're able to bring that product to market, operate it safely on the market, and then also maintain that. And all of these things interact with each other and become a cohesive engineering system. So what I would like to do, now that I've bored you a little bit with that introduction to ESI Group, let's get on board, right? So all aboard, because our next stop is talking about human-centric process validation and virtual product integration with IC.IDO. So let's take a look at a very simplistic view of how products are developed and how we bring them to market. So here in this view, you can see on the far left, normally we start off with a train concept or a locomotive concept, or maybe we're talking about streetcars or trams, buses, or maybe you're not in the rail industry at all and you're worried about cars and trucks and airplanes. But early on, we start off with an engineering concept, and the engineering concept feeds into the engineering and the design of the product. And quite often, in this very early phase of product development, we are performing digital engineering reviews. And what I've illustrated on this slide on the left hand, you can see that here's a conference room, a very typical engineering development picture. And we can see this room is filled with people looking at these displays. And on this display, they are reviewing some design aspect of a new product, and they're trying to validate that product. But one of the challenges we've seen is that in these digital engineering reviews, we really only see things from this external point of view being projected on the screen. And quite often, I'm only seeing what this gentleman in the pink shirt is showing to me. And so I don't always have, if I'm sitting over here on one of these other tables and I'm the manufacturing engineer or I'm the service planning engineer, maybe I don't see my future problems. And I'm limited to how I can see those future problems until I get to control the view that I see on screen, or I have an opportunity to experience my product in person. So now what I'm illustrating is as we complete this product concept, we undergo some product engineering, and maybe we start our commissioning process, where we have some intended customers for this new train, this new locomotive. So in the photos here, if we're trying to sell subway trains to the Metro Transit Authority in New York City, or if we're trying to sell some S-Bahn cars to Deutsche Bahn or one of the European train authorities, and maybe as part of the normal commissioning and the acceptance of this new train or the purchase of this new train by our proposed customers, maybe at this point we can see the opportunity to send our customers to the train, or maybe we send a physical prototype, or maybe we take a previous version of that train and we ship it to our customers, or they come to us, and then we get to actually inspect the train. And we use that physical model, that operable prototype or that commissioning mock-up, and we'll use that as a way to help our customers understand what the train they're looking at or considering buying is good enough for them. And once we can start experiencing a physical train for ourselves, we'll find a whole bunch of things that weren't evident to us when we were looking on screen at digital review models. We quite often emerge new things that were not evident or visible to us in the digital review, and then just by walking up to a physical train and inspecting it, we realize things about the new design which might not be acceptable. Then, as we start getting ready for production, as we start ramping up for serial production, now we start building those first pre-production or early production trains, locomotives, or rolling stock. And in this case, now, as people, you can see all this team of people loading an engine into a chassis, right? They might recognize things that they didn't see when they were touring the train or just viewing that other commissioning model, and they might find things that were not evident in those digital engineering reviews. Now, hopefully, if we recognize something in this pre-production pilot review, this early startup, this early ramp up of our manufacturing environment, if we find anything that's not acceptable, a no build or a bad design condition, hopefully we'll be able to design our way out of it just by modifying something to do with the manufacturing environment or something to do with our service and planning environment, so that we can make a better process or a better set of tooling to help us complete that job. But what really is difficult is if we define something and we find out, we emerge, we discover a new issue that can't be fixed just by modifying manufacturing decisions or by making new service decisions. But instead, we actually have to go back to product geometry. That quite often is something that is very costly, very difficult, and in some cases, it might be impossible or even illegal to try to change that product geometry after the commissioning and acceptance had been done. So what we want to do is we need to find a way to recognize if there are issues that we could resolve a little bit earlier. So let's take a different view on this idea of the issues that can prevent us from having a good, safe, high quality, and low cost product. So if you think about the tools that you normally use in your engineering process, there are the tools that are the baseline CAD tools or digital mock-up tools that we might be using to do our drawings of our product, and also the tools that we're using to plan things like our assembly process or our service procedures. And you can resolve quite a few problems. You can't visualize absolutely everything in CAD, but we can visualize a lot, and we can eliminate many solutions or many issues by using our CAD and DMU tools. And quite often, those might be the only tools available to us in early engineering that we augment with computer-based simulation and the opinions of the experts around me. But then, as I get into that commissioning phase, I get that early access to a mock-up, or in that commissioning, I'm building like the prototype to show my customers. Then by using these physical prototypes or these physical issues, I can also emerge and discover additional problems that were not easily resolvable just by using my CAD or just by using my digital mock-up. And hopefully, I'm able to address and design my way out of those issues all the way down till when I think I have a static design and I've frozen my design. Then, unfortunately, sometimes it'll happen. We'll start building the lineup. So here you can see later on, we've frozen the data and we're starting to ramp up for our start of production, and maybe some new issues or new risks show up. And if those new issues and new risks show up, hopefully we're able to resolve them. But then we put the train out onto the rails. We're running a fleet of trains for our customers. They're using them. And there's always the chance that there are unanticipated or unpredicted risks that emerge well after start of production and as our trains are in service. And that's very difficult. And it's very unlikely that we'll solve all those problems super cost efficiently and very quickly. And what we propose is that if you could do things a little bit differently, and people often talk about this idea of making a leftward shift. If I could shift the discovery of all those problems earlier, then I'd be able to address them earlier. And what we propose is that you could employ this virtual or extended reality solution so that you could help emerge those risks that normally only come when we start working with physical trains and real trains. Maybe we could emerge those by virtualizing the build or virtualizing the maintenance of these trains in a tool like IC.IDO. And by experiencing a train and its operation, its maintenance, and its assembly in VR, I can hopefully address a lot of those remaining issues, and I can discover them earlier. It's almost as if you could take a time machine and fly into the future and experience those unanticipated risks and address them quite early in that left-handed shift of the engineering and before we freeze the data time frame. And that's really what we're proposing in this webinar, is that if we want to be more effective at addressing the challenges of the tomorrow's trains, I can resolve a lot of them today by doing a lot of this work in VR. And so that's what we are proposing, is that we could take this manufacturing and service engineering task and we could start that much earlier, because we could go into VR and validate the decisions we make about our product. I can make sure that the product is packaged and that all of the contents of the train fit within the train quite comfortably. I can validate things like the wiring or the cables or the hoses that are all inside of our train, helping us move electricity around if we're talking about wiring, or maybe pushing hydraulic fluid around, or pneumatic fluid, air pressure for pneumatics. And we can validate that our hoses and our wires are well integrated alongside their solid components and parts inside of that train structure. We can also validate things by making sure that every component is designed and packaged in a way so that it can be installed or can be removed and taken out of that train inside of VR. And that assures that our operators and the tools that they need to use are accessible, reachable, and they can see the train that they need to. And these are the product-based product design integration decisions that we feel are very highly influenced if only I could propel myself into the future and experience that train in a physically realistic but virtual environment. And that's one of the things that we propose you could solve if you used virtual as part of your product development. Only. There are all of the decisions that we have to make regarding the processes or the resources, whether those are human resources or physical tooling resources that we use to bring those products to market and keep them on the rails. So this means doing things like planning the assembly processes or validating the maintenance processes. I can also do things like optimize my tooling design. So if I have specialized jigs or fixtures or tools that help me build my train, I want to validate those as well. And I need to make sure that the assembly line that I'm planning and the service environment that I'm planning is well suited for the trains to be worked on by the people who will be responsible for doing that work. And that's what we see as an overarching value that you can attain if you start doing this virtualization of the build, service, maintenance, or operating of these trains by using a solution like IC.IDO. So first, let's talk about the left-hand side of that sketch, right, where I said we're focused on this task of product integration. Right? Now, product integration is our goal to help accelerate how you cross those project milestones or those gates reviews that you might do, and in making them so that the cross-functional teams have an opportunity to experience, to almost like walk up to and touch and pick up and manipulate that train without having to wait for the construction. So in these pictures that I grabbed from, I want to say I got those from the what is that? Oh, the International Railway Summit. So the International Railway Summit published these pictures and allowed me to use them on Creative Commons copyright. And you can see that these people are touring what is another Deutsche Bahn train system. And this is their first opportunity to walk up to maybe a real train and inspect if that real train is going to suit their needs. So let's take a look at how you might do that using virtual or extended reality. So in the picture that you see, or this video that you see running on the right-hand side of your screen, I have myself and one of my colleagues, and we are doing a subassembly installation of that happens to be a small battery, but we're installing that small battery into a product structure. And we want to make sure that if this is part of the regular assembly of that car or that train, if this is a regular part of maintenance or performing service on that train, that it is something that can be done safely and repeatably without injuring myself and without damaging the train. So I'm able to do things like try to load that battery in. And what you might notice is that as my partner is loading that battery in, we can see these big red arrows popping up on the screen. Each one of those arrows is telling me that my physical object that I'm moving has collided with or interfered with the physical object that I'm loading it into. And that's giving me a really good feeling for, do I have the right amount of clearance for that component? Am I making good use of the space that has been allocated for the installation of that component? And I'm making sure that I can build it. And one of the cool things that I can do is that after I load that battery, load that part into that locomotive frame, if you will, if I can load it in there, I can record the path that it took, and then I could take that path and share that with my engineering colleagues, my method or process planning colleagues, as they're trying to validate the assembly or the service of that future train or future rolling stock, and make sure that that is a good design. So in that product integration task, I'm quite often dealing with those solid bodies, right? Those relatively rigid components like that battery that I was loading inside of that last scene. But also, if you take a look at these screenshots And again, this is that Deutsche Bahn train from the International Railways Summit. Here's a picture of some transit authority workers who are working on a bogie of their train. And you can see all of those hoses and wires that are inside of that assembly. So not only do I have to make sure that the solid body is fit together, but also these flexible hoses and flexible cables able to not only fit in that space, but also as this train is moving and rolling down the tracks, those cables and wires and hoses, they're moving too. And I need to make sure that I design them well, not just for their initial location, which is what's usually reflected in our engineering drawings, but I also have to make sure that they're well packaged for their dynamic behavior. Every time this train articulates, every time this bogie is going down the tracks, we'll see those hoses moving, and I need to make sure that they're well designed and well packaged for that task. So in this video that's rolling right now on your screen, here I am sitting at my desk, and I had just popped my virtual reality headset on my head, and I'm just inspecting this cable route. And right now I'm doing the cable routing like it might be done by an electrical engineer or mechanical engineer much earlier in that design process. So at this point, all I have on my screen is the initial product, the hose, and I have this battery in the back of the train and a motor in the front of that picture. But then you're going to see this video update, and then you'll see some tooling appearing between that battery location and that other location on the other end of the product. And now you can see that if this is the real tooling environment, what seemed like an easy one-person job in that first review that I did, that avatar, that virtual reality me, just had to fly over or through the tooling that separated those two battery points. And that means this is not a one-person job. This is, in fact, a two-person job. So now that I know it's a two-person job, and I've evolved my product design and my process plan enough, you can see on screen now, there are a group of people who are now inside of VR, or I like to say they're in the future. They've traveled into the future, and now they're validating how these two people might complete that cable wiring, that cable routing task. And so this is another very very essential part of our engineering process, is making sure that if there are flexible cables and hoses, that they have the correct length to be initially constructed, but also they have to have enough length and not too much so that a human being could route that cable where it needs to go, attach it at its endpoints, and then as this train or this car or this airplane are doing their job, we want to make sure that they have an appropriate length and behavior to keep themselves from getting pinched or rubbed or anything that would degrade that overall performance. And that's what we're really reaching for when you're doing this virtual prototyping inside of IC.IDO. I want to make sure that every human interaction with this product is something that I could ask humans to do. And quite often, we might find out this isn't a one-person job, this is a multiple-person job, or maybe we have to redesign the entire product. So taking another closer look at this this idea of cable wiring, cable routing, here's another view of that structure, that kind of bulkhead that I was looking at, and it's got some electronics in it. And this particular electronic I can see being plugged in right now, I see what looks like maybe 5 or 6 cables going into some sort of distribution block, or maybe that's some sort of data hub or manifold for. And I have a number of cables that have to be plugged in there. But what's challenging about this assembly is that right now, as you watch that video play, is that it's very difficult for me, while I was in VR, to see where those cables need to be plugged in and to reach my virtual hand into that space, grab onto that wire and plug it in. And this is something that if I was doing this with a regular computer modeling tool, with my regular CAD, I might be tempted to think it looked good on screen, therefore it must be a good process. But in fact, now that I look at it in real scale, like a true to life experience, and I, Eric, try to reach my hand in there to grab those cables, I find that that's difficult to reach the cables. I find it's difficult for me to see the cables. And I'm never really sure if I've got that cable plugged in quite well to the necessary standard. And so this is a risk that normally I can't validate that this design is so challenging until I experienced that train installation physically myself. But by doing it the way you see on this video right now, where I'm in VR and I'm trying to connect those cables to their home position, I can recognize quite quickly that this is a difficult design position, and maybe I should make new, different, and hopefully better decisions about how to connect those cables to that hardware. So that's what we're aiming for when we're talking about using this virtual build, this virtual reality experience to help me validate that I have a well-integrated product and that that product was designed in such a way that it would be easily maintainable by people, that it would be easy for my team. And those are the kind of conclusions that are hopefully all and validated, proven to be true before I freeze my product design and before I get too involved in the commissioning and acceptance of that design. The next thing that I might look at when it comes to trying to validate a future product is I want to help my teams evaluate the maintenance or service processes or validate their assembly and manufacturing processes by letting them experience those trains, those new products, in the context of the process. So here you can see, again, this is another photo that I was able to get from Creative Commons and the Railway Summit and the New York Metro Transit Authority. And here's somebody working on some sort of very complicated electric busing area. And so look at all these cables that have to be connected, and they have to be connected to the right thing with the right amount of length to satisfy the needs of that train. We can see here a team of 3 people trying to do a service or assembly on a bogie and making sure that all the hydraulics and pneumatics reach where they're supposed to reach for that train to function. Or maybe you can see these 2 virtual of the train, making sure that the power is going to be properly picked up from the overhead wires. So when we think about the processes, the human interactions that have to happen for these trains, we can make sure that operations are achievable. So in this video, this is not exactly a rail video, right? This video is somebody working on an aerospace product, but here they are standing on an elevated platform, and they're just validating the installation or the replacement of that looks like some sort of pump, maybe a manifold of some sort for hydraulics or pneumatics or maybe fluid, right, for fuel. And they're sure that they can take it in VR, pick up the virtual pump or that virtual manifold and put it into position. Then you can see now I picked up the little power tool that's used to fasten that into place. And here, one of the things that I'd like you to notice is that this person in green and the person in blue, they are average in height. And we're trying to prove that they could stand on this platform and reach everything that they need to reach to install or replace that object. And what you'll notice is that their little virtual bodies quite often are hanging over the edge of that railing. So once we experienced that, right, once me and my colleague, we had gone into VR and we tried to install that, it felt uncomfortable that we had to lean over so far. So then we brought in this mannequin, this digital human model. And this human model we actually made much taller than the two of us. And what we saw was that even for this 95th percentile height human being, that they were really leaning over and creating some ergonomically uncomfortable positions just to get their hand to the right location so that they could fasten that component into place. So by giving our teams, our stakeholders, the chance that they get to experience that product before we that product, we can help eliminate any procedural maintenance or any sort of assembly process challenges that are built into our product design. And maybe we can make a new decision about how to do this job a little bit safer, how to do this job a little bit easier. Other things that we could validate, take for example that platform. That platform that those people were standing on VR, that's my workspace. And I want to make sure that that workspace is well suited for my workers to interact and do their job with the product and also with the tools that they have to work with. So when we talk about this idea of workspace optimization, I want to teleport everybody to the future and give them the context of this is what the assembly environment's going to look like. This is what the service environment's going to look like. And that way they can evaluate and discover, are there issues? And then hopefully mitigate or resolve those issues entirely. So again, another video example, my colleague and I, we are both standing on a platform, and in this case, we're standing underneath the tail section of a commercial aircraft. And the two of us had to walk underneath that part that we're working on, and you could see that we have to reach well over our heads in order to get to that component. So whatever that part of a train or a plane or a car is that I'm working overhead, I need to make sure that I can reach it. In this second video or second part of the video, now you can see the two of us doing a sub-assembly process, or maybe this is a maintenance on that thing that we had just removed from that overhead compartment. And so now we have a sub-assembly process that we were able to work on, maybe in our service environment, maybe in our assembly bench, that I'm making sure that I can put that ducting on top of that component and also install its other components, its other subassembly requirements. And this lets me validate the working environment without putting my team at risk, right? And some of the stuff that I'm handling in these VR videos is very heavy and very difficult to manipulate by myself. But doing that in VR, I'm keeping myself safe, and I'm also avoiding any injury of my teammates or damage to my assets, damage to the product that I'm trying to validate. And by doing this in VR, I can emerge. Are there issues with the way that I plan on doing this job? Are there issues with the environment people be required to work in for this task? Similarly, we could take a look at any sort of assistive tooling that I have. So whether that assistive tooling is some sort of overhead gantry or overhead crane for picking up the drive assembly for this train on the left, or in this case, you can see I'm using some sort of articulated manipulator hanging from the roof to put a battery in the back of this product that we see in the video. And I can make sure that this tool is well designed, well engineered, so that when I'm operating it, I can see everybody around me. I can see where I'm supposed to put this component and make sure that I'm safely placing it without risking damage to the component, risking breaking the tool, or even worse, injuring my team, injuring myself or my teammates. And this lets us travel to that imaginary future, wherever that future plant or future train would be finally assembled and commissioned. I can make sure that I'm planning that plant out before anybody breaks ground and starts building a new site, before anybody starts making new tooling or making new fixtures. I can validate as much of that in advance so that I can make good, cost-effective decisions. In addition to what we've been talking about so far is that I was in VR and I could experience that it was hard to reach, that I can put VR goggles on you or any of the people that I work with, and then you go into VR and then you find out working overhead or working inside of the space in this, this would be like the electronics bay of your locomotives or of your rolling stock. And we want to make sure, is there enough room for me to do this work? And can I safely install everything? And that was all from a very first person point of view. But I can take that even further. It is possible with virtuality, virtual reality, that if I connect the right pieces of hardware to myself and pair them with my simulation, that now I can record my motion. So in the video on the left, maybe that's my colleague Laura or Meredith, and they're wearing these little tracking objects on their body. And as they're walking around and raising their arms and raising their legs, we are getting immediate feedback on that range of motion. And there are standards and there are guidelines for how much range of motion is considered comfortable and how much range of motion would create discomfort or perhaps even injury. And so by wearing these special virtual reality appliances, if you will, I wear them and I am able to take my own experiences, my own motion, and turn that into recorded objective evidence to find out, is this in fact a safe and viable process? And that's what we want to do. We want to give everybody an opportunity to virtually experience their products well before they make them, far in advance of those decisions becoming too expensive to fix, and resolve them. And another key part of this is taking what I learn about this manufacturing process and capturing it in order for me to communicate it back to the people who proposed those initial decisions, the people who propose what the product looks like versus the process. So what we're showing on screen, I'm going to back the video up to the beginning. This is our current integration with PTC Windchill and MPM, Manufacturing Process Management. And what we're showing here is that we were able to take a component of one of our customers' products, and we were able to take that product data and bring it directly from the CAD and the PLM system into that virtual reality scene that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And that's our manufacturing line proposal. And what we are showing right now is this little animation of these components just flying in a straight line as if by magic from that initial location on the table to the assembly position on the assembly line. And now what we can do is maybe we'll make a decision using our keyboard and mouse that instead of them flying in that magical straight line, maybe we have to carry them over a few feet or a few meters and then walk forward with it another few meters. And I can do that using my keyboard or my mouse or even my space mouse. But then in this part of the video, I've now put on my VR headset. And inside of virtual reality, I am watching that proposed process, and then I am validating. Is that proposed process sensible? Does it make sense that I would grab that little cap and walk over from it from that area and carry it back? And how long is it reasonable for me to ask people to complete these tasks? And we're able to take a process proposal. So this is an assembly process as documented in PTC wind chill as part of their manufacturing process, and I brought it directly into IC.IDO, and then I performed a virtual validation. And I can even put a different process. So in VR, I could record a different assembly sequence or a different assembly order. I can also record things like, what is my walking path? And are there obstructions or barriers to my walking path? I can validate, are these the right tools to make available for people to do that job? And all of those things that I capture could now be annotated, notated inside of this virtual reality review and passed back to my manufacturing and product engineering data sets. So here I am just doing another one of those assembly processes. I'm just playing back this idea of a tryout process, and you're going to see some electronic component fly out of this little dunnage rack and carried over into this little bulkhead to be installed in this electronics bay. And the opportunity that I have is that once I see where that has to be installed for my validation process, that I will be able to record myself installing that myself. And maybe I'll follow a slightly different path than what was proposed. Maybe I'll be able to do that in a shorter time span or as a faster sequence as initially modeled. Steps that I'm taking, I can capture them, I can record them, and if I have an issue with them, I can record them as, here's an engineering issue. Here is a product change request, and I can annotate that in the files that we're working with in IC.IDO, and then I can transfer all of that data back to PTC Windchill if you happen to be a Windchill subscriber, or I can export that data as appropriate XML content that could be brought back into your PLM system, whatever PLM system you're using, and use that as an input for making better decisions in the future. So that's what we are trying to do with IC.IDO. We're trying to help you validate, how do humans interact with your product in those processes like maintenance or just operating and using these products. And we're giving you these true to life experiences with that physics interaction where you could see that if I try to move a solid object through another solid object, physics says you can't make solid objects go through other solid objects. I can make sure all those hoses have the right length, not too long, not too short, make sure that they can plug in and route where they need to. And this I can do, as you saw in all of those videos, I can do this by myself on my desktop, or I could do that collaboratively with my other stakeholders, my other teammates. And that lets me validate these very costly decisions so that I can have the right train on time, on budget, as safe as possible with risk. And that's a great way for us to ensure that these engineering decisions that we've made regarding the system topology and these decisions we've made about the manufacturing of these cast or stamped or solid components, and also these subassembly things like the motors and the batteries, and make sure that all of that componentry is well integrated into our design and is well suited for the processes in which human beings should safely and repeatedly interact with them. And that brings me to the end of my prepared materials for today's discussion. If there are questions that any of you might have, now is a perfect opportunity for you to use the GoToWebinars control panel and dashboard to type in your questions if you have any questions, or you could also type them into me in the chat if necessary. So what questions do you have for me that I could try to answer right now? If you wanted to, you could also use your attendees dashboard to raise your hand. And if you raised your hand, I could go ahead and unmute you and you could ask me your questions if you wanted to. Okay, I can see a question here. Let me make sure that I'm reading the question. Okay, so here's a question. This question is coming from Oscar Caballero. Oscar wanted to know how I am simulating tolerancing adjustments. That's a great question. When we're doing these VR validations of the assembly or the integration or the that replacement, removal and replacement, I'm normally working on a scale that I don't normally refer to as tolerances. I'm working on a scale of making sure there's enough room, and we're not splitting hairs about the fineness of the tolerances. So there are lots of tools that exist in the world for doing geometric dimensioning and tolerancing. And in your CAD and in your finite element, you're making sure that these fine tolerances are being met. And what's surprising, right? Those of you who work with tolerancing and work with, sizing these engineering drawings, we work on these millimeter or sub-millimeter scales all the time, and you'd be shocked how often people are missing the decisions or clearances on a bigger scale of, I can't fit my hand in there, right? So what I'm really focused on and what we focused on is, I'll call it the low-hanging fruit of clearances. I'm not stipulating here the tolerances. I'm making sure that I can fit my hand, or if I'm talking about, like in this case, this cup or this cup, I want to make sure that the things in my hands and the stuff you saw me manipulating in VR could be carried by a person into position. So most of the time, I don't even like saying the word tolerance. I'm not doing clearances based on tolerancing. There are digital tools that already help you do tolerancing. What I'm focused on are the gross motor skills, the large detail, is that if there's not enough room for me to pick up that pump or that housing from one of those videos and put it into place, the tolerancing doesn't even matter. The tolerancing happens after I prove that a person can pick it up and put it into position. So hopefully that helps address your question, Oscar. Go ahead and let me know if that answers your question. But the real answer, the simple answer I can give you, is that we try to solve those large motions that a human being operating on their handheld scale or larger is able to manipulate and move things in position. Because if I can't do that, then my fine detail, which already exists in your engineering drawings, those tolerances don't matter if a person can't pick it up in their hands and put it into place. So hopefully that answers your question, Oscar. What other questions or comments are coming from any of the participants? All right, well, that kind of looks like all the questions that are coming in. I'm not seeing anybody raising their hands, so either I did a terrible job or I did a good job of answering your questions. Hopefully I did a good enough job answering your questions, but if you do have any other questions for us, go ahead and reach out to us via the email address that I have on my slide right here. So if you have a question you want to ask me directly, go ahead and send me an email. I'd be pleased to answer them for you as soon as they occur to you. And if that's going to be it, I think it's safe for me to go ahead and end today's webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, for giving me an hour of your time today. And I look forward to interacting with you through the email, or maybe I'll catch some of you sometime riding the rails or out about in the world. Thank you very much, everyone. And, oh, Oscar, okay. Oscar, you're welcome. I'm glad I could answer your question. De nada, not a K. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and I appreciate your time and your investment in joining us, and we look forward to answering your questions in the future.